Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to the English Globe, the place where we understand world politics with calm minds and clear analysis. And today, we are opening an episode that feels like the beginning of a global thriller. Because when the President of the United States stands behind a podium and delivers a speech that instantly shakes discussions in Europe, alarms strategy rooms in Asia, and sparks urgent conversations across the Middle East, the world does not simply listen politely, but instead begins calculating risks, preparing responses, and asking one powerful question. Is this the start of a crisis or the beginning of a carefully designed strategy?
Before we go deeper, please support the English Globe by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and telling us in the comments where you are listening from and what you honestly think about today's topic. Because this channel is not only about learning English, but also about building an intelligent global community where listeners from many countries can respectfully share ideas about politics, economics, and world events that shape our future together. Today's topic matters because words spoken by the leader of the world's largest economy can move currencies, influence alliances, and reshape diplomatic expectations. And when President Donald Trump recently delivered a speech that immediately triggered headlines, emergency policy meetings, and intense online debate, it showed us again that presidential speeches are not only national events, but global signals that every government studies carefully to understand what might happen next in trade, security, and international cooperation.
Within minutes of the speech, analysts began asking whether the message signaled stronger economic protection policies, new negotiating pressure on trade partners, or a warning to strategic competitors, and markets reacted with uncertainty because investors know that political language can become real policy faster than expected, which means that even a single phrase about tariffs, alliances, or defense commitments can change expectations about jobs, energy prices, and global stability in ways that affect ordinary citizens across continents.
Some leaders described the speech as bold strategy, saying strong language can strengthen negotiating power and show determination in difficult global talks, while others warned that the tone might increase diplomatic tension and create misunderstanding between allies. And I personally believe there is truth in both views, because in modern geopolitics, leaders often speak strongly not to create conflict, but to gain advantage before negotiations. Yet those same words can still cause fear if partners are unsure about future policy direction.
I agree with you on that point, Julia, because history shows that strong rhetoric can sometimes lead to major agreements rather than confrontation. Yet it is also true that careless wording can damage trust built over decades, and this is why today's discussion is important for English learners and global citizens alike, because understanding the difference between emotional headlines and strategic communication helps us see politics more clearly and prevents us from reacting with panic to complex international developments.
Another reason this topic is important is the speed of modern information, because social media turned one speech into millions of opinions within hours, with commentators praising leadership strength, critics warning about instability, and ordinary citizens trying to understand what it all means for their jobs, security, and future. And I believe this shows how essential it is to listen carefully, compare different perspectives, and analyze policy content instead of judging only by dramatic headlines.
Exactly. And this episode will carefully examine what was said, how different countries reacted, why markets responded, and how media framing shaped public perception, because our goal is not to attack personalities, but to understand policy impact, strategic messaging, and international reaction in a balanced educational way that helps you improve your listening skills while also becoming more informed about the complex world we live in.
As we begin, keep one thought in mind. In today's interconnected global system, a speech in one capital can echo through trade routes, defense alliances, and diplomatic negotiations everywhere. And that is why we must ask seriously whether President Trump's message represents warning signs of rising political tension or a calculated strategy designed to reshape negotiations in America's favor. Because sometimes in global politics, crisis and strategy look almost identical at the beginning.
So stay with us as we explore this question step by step with calm analysis, real global context, and respectful discussion. And remember to share your opinion in the comments about whether you believe this speech was a signal of crisis, a demonstration of strategy, or a mixture of both, because your voice matters in this global conversation, and together we can learn how to understand world politics more wisely and more clearly. When we carefully examine the recent speech delivered by President Donald Trump, the first thing that becomes clear is how important the setting was to the message itself, because the address was given at a major national event in Washington before political leaders, industry representatives, and media organizations, with strong patriotic symbolism and carefully chosen language designed to communicate confidence to citizens of the United States, while also signaling seriousness to observers in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, who were closely watching every word for policy clues.
I agree, Adam, because when leaders speak in a formal national setting with strong symbolic visuals and a carefully prepared audience, it shows that the message is meant to carry both domestic reassurance and international signaling at the same time. And in this speech, we saw that clearly through the main themes of national security, economic sovereignty, trade policy, and foreign relations, which together created a narrative that America must stay strong at home in order to stay influential abroad, a point that many supporters praised as realistic, while critics questioned how it might affect global cooperation.
Exactly, Julia. And one of the strongest parts of the speech was the emphasis on protecting American industries, because President Trump argued that dependence on foreign supply chains can create risk during crises, and he described policies aimed at rebuilding manufacturing, securing energy production, and strengthening strategic sectors as necessary steps to maintain stability and negotiation power, which I think reflects a broader global trend where many countries are reconsidering economic vulnerability after recent international disruptions.
Yes, and I also noticed how he connected economic sovereignty with national security, saying that strong industries support strong defense and stable employment, and I believe that message was carefully designed for domestic voters who worry about jobs and inflation, while at the same time, it sent a signal to trade partners that future agreements would focus heavily on fairness and balance, which explains why markets reacted quickly even though no specific new policy announcement was made in that moment.
Another key part of the speech was his comments about alliances, where he said partnerships remain important, but must be based on shared responsibility, and I think this language was intentionally firm but not directly confrontational, because it encourages allies to negotiate contributions while still keeping cooperation possible, although some analysts in Europe interpreted it as pressure, showing how the same sentence can be understood differently depending on national perspective and political interest.
I completely agree, because tone matters enormously in presidential speeches, and even when the policy content stays the same, stronger language can create concern about future changes, especially during a period of global tension. And in this case, the speech used confident and independent language that supporters described as leadership strength, while others saw it as a sign of tougher negotiation tactics that might increase uncertainty before agreements are reached.
On trade policy, President Trump again mentioned tariffs and enforcement tools as options to protect American workers, and although he did not announce immediate action, the message was clear that economic pressure remains part of his strategy, which is important because such statements influence expectations in global markets and business planning, and I believe he used this language to show readiness without closing the door to negotiation, a balance that many leaders try to achieve in competitive economic diplomacy.
Yes, and that connects to another important point, which is the difference between diplomatic language and campaign-style rhetoric. Because diplomatic language is usually calm and cautious to avoid misunderstanding, while campaign language is emotional and motivating. And in this speech, we heard a mixture of both styles, which suggests the message was meant to energize domestic audiences while also sending calculated signals to foreign governments, a strategy that often appears strong at home but creates debate abroad.
Timing also played a huge role, because the speech came during a period of global economic uncertainty and ongoing geopolitical competition. And when leaders speak strongly at such moments, observers naturally wonder whether they are preparing policy changes, negotiating advantages, or responding to pressure, which is why this address quickly became an international discussion topic and showed again how leadership communication can influence expectations before any official policy decision is made. So when we ask what exactly President Trump said, the answer is not only about individual sentences, but about the full message that combined strength, independence, negotiation readiness, and domestic reassurance. And I agree with you, Adam, that understanding political communication in international relations means looking beyond headlines to analyze context, tone, timing, and strategic purpose. Because only then can listeners form balanced opinions instead of reacting only to dramatic interpretations. That is exactly our goal in this podcast, Julia, to help listeners understand how presidential speeches function as signals in global politics, influencing alliances, markets, and public opinion at the same time. And as we continue this discussion, we will explore how different countries interpreted these themes and whether the speech represents crisis, strategy, or a complex mixture of both in the evolving landscape of international relations. Inside the United States, the reaction to President Donald Trump's speech was immediate and intense, reflecting the highly polarized nature of American politics today, because members of Congress were quick to respond on both sides of the aisle, with supporters praising what they called strong and decisive leadership that reinforces America's global standing and protects domestic interests, while critics raised concerns that some of the language could complicate diplomatic relationships and potentially escalate tensions unnecessarily, illustrating the delicate balance between demonstrating strength and maintaining constructive dialogue in Washington.
Exactly, Adam. And I think what is particularly interesting is how the speech energized political bases, because strong statements about national security, trade, and economic sovereignty resonate deeply with voters who prioritize American self-reliance. And this effect becomes especially important when the country is approaching critical elections or high-stakes negotiations, because speeches like this are not only policy tools, but also strategic devices to shape public perception, increase engagement, and solidify support within key constituencies.
Yes, and the media played a major role in shaping how Americans perceived the speech, because networks and opinion platforms immediately highlighted different aspects depending on their editorial perspective, some emphasizing leadership and strategic vision, others focusing on potential diplomatic risks or economic uncertainty. And this framing had a direct influence on public discussion, demonstrating that in today's media environment, the impact of a speech extends far beyond the words themselves to include how journalists and commentators interpret and amplify them.
I completely agree, Adam. And another factor is how the stock market responded in real time, because investors pay close attention to presidential rhetoric, especially when it touches on trade policy, tariffs, and regulatory expectations. And in this case, market indices showed cautious movement as analysts digested the potential implications of stronger economic sovereignty language, illustrating how political signals influence economic behavior even before any formal policy is enacted.
Beyond markets, the business community also reacted quickly, with corporate leaders evaluating whether the statements suggested new opportunities for domestic production or risks associated with shifting international agreements. And this kind of attention is particularly important because companies make long-term investment decisions based on expectations about stability, regulatory policy, and global competitiveness. So speeches of this magnitude can have tangible effects on business strategy, even without new laws or executive actions.
At the same time, public opinion polls reflected the usual divisions in American society, with strong approval from supporters who felt reassured by the president's decisive messaging, while critics expressed skepticism about the potential impact on foreign relations and domestic economic stability. And although trends differed across states and demographic groups, the overall pattern reinforced that presidential speeches can both unify and polarize, depending on audience perception and underlying political identity.
I also want to emphasize that congressional reactions were particularly telling because lawmakers from the president's party largely praised the speech as a reaffirmation of leadership vision, while opposition members questioned whether the tone could complicate diplomatic negotiations and asked for more clarity on specific policy intentions. And this dynamic demonstrates the interplay between executive messaging and legislative interpretation, as Congress both monitors and responds to presidential communication to guide legislative planning and oversight responsibilities.
And the timing of the speech amplified its impact, because delivering strong language during moments of economic uncertainty or international negotiation increases its visibility and encourages immediate reaction, which in turn energizes political supporters and engages opponents in public debate, creating a cycle where political communication functions simultaneously as messaging, strategy, and public testing of policies, which is a phenomenon we see repeatedly in American democracy, where rhetoric shapes not only perception but also the political agenda itself.
Moreover, social media and digital platforms magnified the domestic conversation because ordinary citizens, activists, and analysts quickly shared clips, commentary, and analysis, turning the speech into a nationwide discussion within hours, which reinforced the polarization effect while also giving an opportunity for broader civic engagement. And it highlighted how modern communication channels transform speeches into living debates that extend far beyond the walls of the event hall.
Exactly, Adam. And this effect is particularly important because it shows how speeches can influence behavior beyond traditional political arenas, from voter enthusiasm to media coverage, from corporate strategy to financial decisions, meaning that understanding the domestic impact requires looking at the combined effect of legislative response, public reaction, market movement, and media interpretation, rather than focusing only on the words themselves.
In summary, the domestic reaction to President Trump's speech demonstrates how a single address can energize political bases, provoke debate in Congress, influence business expectations, and shift market behavior almost simultaneously. And Julia, I think we can both agree that this shows the power of presidential rhetoric to shape democratic debate and reveal the deep polarization that exists in American society today.
Absolutely, Adam. I also want to add that analyzing these reactions helps listeners understand the interplay between leadership communication and public perception. Because in a democracy, speeches serve multiple functions: motivating supporters, signaling policy intentions, testing public opinion, and influencing the conversation in both political and economic arenas. And this dual effect of rhetoric and interpretation is central to understanding modern American politics in a comprehensive and educational way.
So as we move forward in this podcast, we will examine how these domestic dynamics interact with international responses, showing how a speech that energizes a home audience can simultaneously create ripples of caution, analysis, and strategic recalculation around the world, highlighting the full scope of presidential influence in today's interconnected global system.
And that dual perspective is exactly what makes studying political communication so valuable for English learners and global citizens alike, because understanding not only the content but also the reception of a speech provides insight into both the mechanics of governance and the strategies behind leadership, preparing listeners to analyze future events with clarity, balance, and critical thinking skills.
In the next section, we will explore how international allies and partners reacted to the speech, because while domestic reactions provide one layer of understanding, the global perspective reveals the complex interplay between national messaging and foreign interpretation, which often shapes diplomatic relationships and long-term strategic decisions.
Exactly, Adam. And following this discussion will help listeners recognize the broader context of global politics and how a single address in Washington can influence decisions from Brussels to Beijing to Riyadh, making it clear that presidential speeches are never just domestic events. They are signals with worldwide implications that demand careful attention and thoughtful analysis.
Across the Atlantic, the reaction to President Donald Trump's speech was immediate and closely scrutinized by European leaders because statements about defense, trade, and sovereignty carry particular weight for countries that rely on close coordination with the United States in matters of security and economic policy. And within hours, several officials from key EU member states and NATO representatives released measured statements emphasizing the importance of continued cooperation, while quietly signaling concern over language that suggested stricter expectations for burden sharing and new approaches to alliance obligations.
I agree, Adam. What stood out to me was how the speech sparked discussions about NATO dynamics and the concept of strategic autonomy within Europe, because leaders in Berlin, Paris, and Brussels are now debating how much Europe should rely on American security guarantees versus investing in independent defense capabilities. And this is not just theoretical. It affects military planning, joint exercises, and budget priorities, which shows that the speech had a real impact beyond political commentary and into strategic calculations for member nations.
Exactly, Julia. Several European ministers highlighted that while the alliance remains vital, there is increasing concern about whether the United States will maintain its historical defense commitments, especially when paired with strong rhetoric about economic sovereignty and trade protection, and that concern is further complicated by ongoing debates over defense spending within NATO, because some member countries are re-evaluating whether they can meet both European and transatlantic responsibilities under current security and budgetary pressures.
Yes, and trade policy implications were another major focus for European capitals, Adam, because the president's emphasis on protecting American industries and readiness to leverage tariffs sends signals to European exporters that negotiations may become more assertive. And while some EU leaders interpret this as tactical pressure designed to achieve short-term concessions, others worry it may foreshadow a more permanent shift toward economic policies that prioritize US domestic interests over multilateral agreements, which could reshape the transatlantic trade landscape significantly.
I think that's an important point, Julia, because it highlights the dual nature of the speech. From Europe's perspective, it could be read either as a negotiation tactic meant to strengthen U.S. leverage in upcoming trade discussions, or as an indication of a potential long-term policy adjustment that will force allies to reconsider economic and security strategies, and this uncertainty drives both diplomatic caution and public debate across European media.
Absolutely, Adam. And when we talk about economic interdependence, it is clear that Europe and the United States rely heavily on each other, not just for trade, but also for financial stability, supply chains, and technological collaboration. So statements that hint at changes in US trade policy create ripple effects that influence investment decisions, industrial planning, and strategic coordination. Which is why even measured European responses are accompanied by intensive internal discussions about how to protect shared interests while maintaining strong transatlantic relations.
The speech also triggered discussions in NATO circles about burden sharing, operational readiness, and the future of collective defense. Because when a leading member signals that contributions and responsibilities need reassessment, allies begin recalculating budgets, training priorities, and mission planning, which in turn can influence ongoing commitments in Eastern Europe, the Mediterranean, and even global deployments where U.S. participation is essential, highlighting the delicate balance between alliance solidarity and independent decision-making.
I completely agree, Adam. And this is where strategic autonomy debates come into play, because while NATO remains the cornerstone of European defense, national leaders are increasingly asking whether Europe should develop capabilities that reduce reliance on any single partner, especially when US statements create ambiguity about future commitments. and this reflects a broader trend towards self-sufficiency in defense while still valuing the transatlantic alliance, which requires careful diplomatic messaging to prevent misunderstandings.
One of the interesting aspects of the European response is how carefully measured it has been publicly, because governments want to avoid unnecessary alarm while simultaneously signaling that they are interpreting the speech seriously, and this balance shows that Europe is treating the president's remarks both as potential negotiation pressure and as a possible policy indicator, weighing immediate tactical responses against long-term strategic planning.
Exactly, Adam. And I think it's important to note that the speech also prompted conversations among European analysts about whether a more assertive US posture could influence EU unity, especially in economic and defense policymaking, because member countries may respond differently depending on their national priorities, which adds another layer of complexity to transatlantic relations and highlights why understanding both rhetoric and reaction is essential for anyone following international politics.
So, in conclusion, the European response demonstrates that even a single presidential speech can have multidimensional effects. It challenges perceptions of security commitments, influences trade expectations, and sparks debates about strategic autonomy and alliance cohesion, while at the same time reinforcing that diplomacy requires careful interpretation of both words and intent, because allies must balance their responses to maintain cooperation without compromising national or regional interests.
I agree, Adam. And as listeners, it's crucial to recognize that statements like this are never just symbolic. They drive real decisions in capitals from Brussels to Berlin to Paris, shaping defense budgets, trade negotiations, and multinational coordination. And understanding this dynamic helps us see how transatlantic relations and alliance politics operate in practice, providing insight into the complex interplay between leadership communication, strategic interests, and international cooperation.
In the next section, we will shift our focus to China and examine how President Trump's speech was received in Asia, particularly in Beijing, where economic, technological, and strategic implications are being closely evaluated. And this will allow us to understand the broader global context and see how different regions interpret the same speech through their own geopolitical lens.
Exactly, Adam. And following that discussion will help listeners appreciate how a single speech can simultaneously influence allies and competitors, highlighting the intricate web of international relations that makes global politics both challenging and fascinating to study.
After analyzing Europe's response, it is essential to look east and consider how President Donald Trump's speech was perceived in China, because the words of the U.S. president carry enormous weight in Beijing, where government analysts, media outlets, and policy planners carefully study every nuance for implications on trade, technology, and security. And within hours of the address, Chinese state media began framing the speech as both a reaffirmation of American assertiveness and a signal of potential negotiation tactics, highlighting tensions in economic and strategic areas, while emphasizing that China remains committed to long-term development and multilateral cooperation.
I agree, Adam. And what struck me most was how the speech intensified discussions about technology rivalry, because the president's references to protecting American industries, securing supply chains, and maintaining competitive advantage in critical sectors like semiconductors and artificial intelligence directly intersect with China's ongoing investment in high-tech industries. And this framing prompted Chinese analysts to interpret the speech not only as a policy statement, but also as a strategic signal meant to influence both domestic and international perception of U.S. global leadership.
Exactly, Julia. Beyond technology, trade implications were a major focus, because when the president highlighted tariffs, fair competition, and protection of domestic markets, Beijing naturally evaluated potential consequences for Chinese exports, supply chain resilience, and ongoing negotiations on bilateral trade agreements. And the speech prompted intense discussion about how the U.S. may leverage economic tools in the near future to shape competitive advantage, especially in industries critical to both countries' economic security.
Yes, and in addition to trade and technology, the speech also raised questions about supply chain considerations, Adam, because global reliance on interconnected manufacturing networks means that statements about reshoring production or prioritizing domestic industries can create ripple effects far beyond the borders of the United States, forcing Chinese companies and policymakers to assess vulnerability, consider alternative sourcing, and evaluate how future US policies may alter global production and logistics strategies.
Another dimension is strategic messaging between Washington and Beijing, Julia, because while the speech was public and directed toward both domestic and international audiences, it also contained subtle signals for China regarding negotiation posture, red lines, and expectations for reciprocity, which demonstrates the dual purpose of presidential rhetoric: to reassure domestic voters while sending calculated messages to strategic competitors, a balancing act that is central to great power diplomacy.
Exactly, Adam. Tariffs and economic leverage were central themes because Beijing recognizes that economic tools have become primary instruments of US strategy in areas ranging from energy imports to advanced manufacturing, and the president's emphasis on readiness to use such tools reinforces that economic competition is inseparable from national security considerations, prompting China to continue developing countermeasures, diversifying supply chains, and investing in emerging technologies to maintain strategic parity.
I also noticed that competition in sectors such as artificial intelligence, clean energy, and manufacturing received particular attention because both countries see leadership in these areas as essential for long-term economic growth and geopolitical influence, and analysts in China interpreted the speech as a reminder that technological dominance and industrial resilience are core elements of strategic positioning, signaling that global competition is not only political, but increasingly economic and technological.
That's an important point, Adam, because it raises the question: is this speech an escalation, or is it primarily a tool for negotiation signaling? On one hand, the language could be interpreted as toughening America's position in ongoing negotiations, designed to maximize leverage without immediate confrontation. On the other hand, Beijing must evaluate whether these statements hint at a broader shift toward unilateral policy measures that could challenge international norms, and the ambiguity creates both caution and opportunity for careful diplomacy.
I agree, Julia. The speech functions on multiple levels simultaneously: domestically to reassure voters and demonstrate leadership, and internationally to test reactions, signal priorities, and reinforce negotiating positions. And this dual nature is why analysts in China and around the world pay close attention to both the explicit content and the implied intentions, because misreading rhetoric can have economic, diplomatic, and security consequences.
And for listeners, it's important to understand that this is not simply a bilateral interaction between Washington and Beijing. It reflects a broader pattern of great power competition, where trade, technology, and supply chain considerations intersect with diplomacy and strategic planning, illustrating how modern geopolitical rivalries are multidimensional and how leadership communication is carefully designed to influence not only policies but also perceptions in multiple countries simultaneously.
In conclusion, the Chinese perspective highlights the complexity of global power competition because every statement from the U.S. president is analyzed through lenses of trade, technology, energy, and supply chain security, while simultaneously influencing negotiation strategies and signaling intent. And we can both agree, Julia, that understanding these dynamics is essential for anyone studying international relations, because it reveals how rhetoric and strategic communication function as tools in the competitive arena of global politics.
Absolutely, Adam. And as we move forward in the next section, we will examine reactions from the Middle East and the Global South, showing how countries with strategic and economic ties to both Washington and Beijing interpret these signals, highlighting the interconnectedness of global politics and the complex web of interests that shape international responses to high-level speeches.
Exactly, Julia. And that perspective will help listeners see how one speech can ripple across multiple regions, influencing alliances, trade, and security dynamics in ways that require careful analysis and nuanced understanding, reinforcing the importance of both observation and critical thinking when following global political developments. Moving from Asia, it is essential to examine how President Donald Trump's speech was received in the Middle East and among countries of the Global South, because U.S. statements about national security, trade policy, and economic sovereignty immediately attract attention in regions where energy production, strategic partnerships, and financial stability are closely tied to Washington's decisions. Gulf countries, in particular, responded with careful analysis. While official statements remained diplomatic and measured, policymakers quietly debated the implications for security cooperation, arms deals, and joint military operations, because any indication of a change in American priorities or alliance expectations can influence regional planning, military readiness, and bilateral trust.
Exactly, Adam. Another critical factor is the sensitivity of global oil markets, because Gulf producers are acutely aware that even subtle shifts in U.S. energy or trade rhetoric can influence crude prices, investment decisions, and long-term energy contracts. And when the president emphasized protecting American industries while reassessing trade and alliances, countries in the Middle East interpreted this as a signal to consider diversification strategies, hedge risks, and monitor Washington closely for any forthcoming policy changes, showing how a single speech can resonate far beyond North America.
Yes, and beyond the Gulf, security cooperation was a major topic of discussion, because many countries in the Middle East rely on coordinated efforts with the U.S. on counterterrorism, maritime security, and regional stabilization, and any speech that highlights independence, sovereignty, or transactional alliances immediately raises questions about how reliably Washington will participate in ongoing operations, which in turn affects planning, intelligence sharing, and regional diplomatic negotiations.
I agree, Adam. And looking at the broader Global South, emerging economies are closely analyzing the speech to understand how shifts in American policy might affect trade, investment, and multilateral cooperation, especially in sectors such as energy, technology, and infrastructure, because these countries are increasingly connected to U.S. markets while simultaneously exploring alternatives, like engaging more with BRICS nations or regional trade agreements, as a way to balance global influence and protect economic growth.
That's an excellent point, Julia. In fact, discussions about BRICS and economic diversification immediately intensified after the speech, because countries such as India, Brazil, and South Africa interpreted U.S. statements about industrial protection and tariffs as indirect pressure to recalibrate trade alignments, prompting renewed debates about alternative supply chains, currency stabilization, and collaborative development initiatives, highlighting how American domestic messaging reverberates through multilateral economic planning.
And this is where energy diplomacy becomes especially critical, Adam, because the Middle East and the Global South understand that U.S. emphasis on protecting domestic energy production and ensuring strategic reserves can alter global oil and gas flows, influence pricing, and shift geopolitical alliances, meaning that any perception of U.S. prioritization of domestic security over global stability triggers careful recalculation by governments that rely on energy exports or imports, creating a chain reaction in regional policy decisions.
Exactly, Julia. Another factor is financial markets and currency considerations, because nations in the Global South often manage trade exposure and debt repayments in U.S. dollars. So strong rhetoric about economic independence or trade protection can influence currency exchange expectations, commodity contracts, and portfolio decisions, which is why policymakers interpret presidential speeches not only as political statements, but also as potential signals affecting economic stability and investor confidence.
Yes, and beyond economics, stability concerns are paramount, because countries in these regions constantly evaluate whether American messaging signals continuity in diplomatic support, military assistance, or trade reliability. And any ambiguity can heighten strategic caution, prompt diversification of partners, or accelerate multilateral initiatives to reduce dependency on a single global power, reinforcing the importance of multipolar thinking in a rapidly evolving international system.
In addition, energy diplomacy and strategic engagement are deeply interconnected with these reactions, because countries in the Middle East and the Global South must simultaneously maintain relations with the US, China, Europe, and regional neighbors, balancing commitments while interpreting signals about policy shifts, trade, and security, which highlights the complexity of global politics, where leadership statements in Washington have immediate ripple effects across continents.
Absolutely, Adam. And when we step back to look at the educational lesson for listeners, the reactions in the Middle East and the Global South illustrate the nature of a multipolar world, where power is distributed among multiple influential players and where alliances are increasingly fluid rather than rigid, because nations must constantly weigh political statements, economic risks, and security commitments to protect national interests, all while maintaining relationships in a global environment that is complex, competitive, and interconnected.
I completely agree, Julia. This section also reinforces how speeches serve multiple purposes beyond domestic politics. They are instruments of signaling, negotiation, and influence that reach countries dependent on or partnered with the United States, and understanding this broader perspective allows us to see how one presidential address can shape discussions on security, trade, and diplomacy thousands of miles away, shaping decision-making in both regional and global contexts.
So in summary, the Middle East and Global South reactions reveal the intricate balance countries must maintain in response to US messaging, interpreting the speech as either negotiation signaling or potential policy change, adjusting energy and economic strategies accordingly, and considering the stability of alliances in a multipolar environment, which is exactly why careful analysis of such speeches is a critical skill for students of international relations and global politics alike.
Exactly, Julia. And as we move to the next section, we will explore the global economic impact more closely, examining how investors, multinational corporations, and trade organizations reacted to the speech, providing a full picture of both political and financial responses that together shape the modern geopolitical landscape.
Yes, Adam, this perspective will help listeners understand how policy, markets, and strategy intersect, showing that global reactions are not just abstract concepts, but have real consequences for nations, businesses, and citizens worldwide.
Turning now to the economic consequences of President Donald Trump's recent speech, it quickly became evident that financial markets responded with a mix of caution and recalibration, because when the leader of the world's largest economy signals protectionist measures, emphasizes industrial sovereignty, or discusses tariffs, investors immediately reassess risk exposure, portfolio allocations, and currency positioning, and within hours, stock indices in the United States showed minor fluctuations as traders digested potential implications for multinational corporations and sectors most sensitive to global trade shifts, particularly technology, energy, and manufacturing industries.
Absolutely, Adam. And what is fascinating is how investor psychology interacts with political messaging. Because even without concrete policy changes, the speech created an immediate perception of uncertainty, which encourages risk-averse behavior, hedging strategies, and recalibration of global investment decisions. And I think this demonstrates a central point. Markets are not responding just to enacted policies, but to anticipated ones, meaning the way a statement is framed can have economic consequences even before legislation or executive action is taken.
Exactly, Julia. And currency movements illustrate this point clearly, because the US dollar strengthened slightly against certain emerging market currencies following the speech, reflecting investor interpretation that trade protection and economic sovereignty might favor domestic capital and exports, while simultaneously creating pressure on countries with significant dollar-denominated debt, showing that even the expectation of policy shifts can ripple through global finance, influencing both short-term trading behavior and longer-term economic planning.
Yes, and energy markets reacted immediately as well, Adam, because oil prices are highly sensitive to both geopolitical statements and economic expectations, and the President's remarks regarding industrial protection, domestic energy production, and strategic independence prompted traders to anticipate possible shifts in global energy demand or supply, particularly in relation to Gulf exports, renewable energy competition, and U.S. domestic production incentives, which demonstrates the tight connection between political communication and energy economics in an interdependent world.
In addition, trade partners expressed uncertainty because rhetoric about fair competition, tariffs, and domestic prioritization introduces ambiguity into ongoing negotiations, and businesses with exposure to both U.S. and international markets must evaluate whether supply chains will be disrupted, whether new trade agreements will be renegotiated, or whether the U.S. will exercise leverage selectively to achieve economic advantage. And this uncertainty naturally leads to adjustments in procurement, investment, and risk management.
Exactly, Adam. And I also want to highlight how corporations respond under this uncertainty, because executives weigh not only immediate market reactions, but also long-term strategic positioning, considering whether to diversify production, relocate facilities, or renegotiate supplier contracts. And the President's speech effectively functions as a signal that companies must interpret carefully, balancing optimism for opportunity with caution against potential disruptions, which illustrates the intersection between political communication and corporate strategy.
One interesting aspect is the question of whether rhetoric always becomes policy, Julia. Because while strong language about tariffs or economic sovereignty can suggest decisive action, history shows that statements often function more as strategic signaling or negotiation leverage than immediate legislative changes. And this distinction matters for both investors and trade partners, because overreacting to rhetoric without analyzing institutional and procedural realities can result in misallocated resources or unnecessary financial volatility.
Exactly, Adam. And this is where risk calculation in global finance becomes critical, because investors, analysts, and corporate boards all assess not only the likelihood of specific policy outcomes, but also the timing, potential intensity, and secondary effects on global supply chains, currency stability, and market sentiment, showing that political statements must be interpreted with context, history, and realistic probability in mind, rather than simply reacting to dramatic headlines.
I also noticed that energy diplomacy and market sensitivity intersect in a way that highlights the globalized nature of modern finance, because U.S. policy signals influence decisions in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East simultaneously, affecting pricing, investment flows, and strategic reserves. And this underscores how speeches that emphasize national priorities can have unintended or secondary consequences that shape global economic trends in real time.
Yes, Adam. And the broader educational takeaway for listeners is that political communication, particularly from influential leaders, is inseparable from economics, because words about trade, defense, or industrial policy immediately inform calculations in financial markets, corporate planning, and energy management, illustrating how closely intertwined politics and economics have become in a globalized system where information travels instantly and reactions are rapid.
In conclusion, Julia, we can see that the speech impacted markets, currency valuations, oil prices, and trade expectations, not necessarily because immediate policy was enacted, but because the rhetoric signaled priorities, intentions, and potential leverage, forcing global actors to reconsider risk, adjust portfolios, and rethink supply chains, which demonstrates that political leadership shapes economic behavior through both action and communication.
Exactly, Adam. And as listeners, it's critical to understand that evaluating the impact of such speeches requires analyzing the relationship between words and anticipated outcomes, because global finance reacts not just to policy, but to perception. And this insight equips students of economics and international relations with a deeper understanding of the feedback loop connecting political messaging and market behavior.
In the next section, we will examine how media coverage around the world framed the speech, shaping public interpretation and political narratives, which provides another layer of understanding about how presidential communication influences not only policy and markets, but also global perception and discourse.
Yes, Adam, because media framing creates the lens through which citizens, investors, and governments interpret these statements, and understanding that lens is essential to analyzing both domestic and international consequences of high-level political messaging.
As we move deeper into analysis, Julia, it becomes clear that President Donald Trump's speech can be interpreted in two very different ways, because the content, tone, and timing all lend themselves to multiple readings depending on perspective, and the first interpretation emphasizes a potential crisis narrative, suggesting that the speech signals rising instability in international relations, increased diplomatic strain, and heightened global uncertainty, because statements about American sovereignty, industrial protection, and defense expectations can be perceived by allies and rivals alike as unpredictable or unilateral, creating tension in trade, security, and alliance networks.
I agree, Adam. And when we consider this crisis perspective, we see why some analysts in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East immediately reacted with concern. Because strong rhetoric can amplify fears about sudden policy shifts, affect investor confidence, and even influence internal political debates within allied nations, which demonstrates that the perception of instability is often just as impactful as any actual policy change. And it reinforces the idea that words alone can generate ripple effects across diplomatic, economic, and security arenas.
Exactly, Julia. But there is also a second interpretation that frames the speech as strategic negotiation, where President Trump is actively positioning the United States to maximize leverage in both domestic and international arenas. And from this perspective, the speech is not a sign of crisis, but a deliberate tool to shape expectations, create bargaining power, and reinforce domestic authority, because by signaling readiness to act, emphasizing economic tools, and highlighting the importance of sovereignty, the president communicates both strength to citizens and negotiation seriousness to allies and rivals without immediately committing to specific policy actions.
Yes, Adam, and historical examples reinforce this pattern, because leaders often use strong rhetoric ahead of major agreements or international negotiations, signaling resolve, testing reactions, and setting parameters for compromise. And in many cases, these speeches function as a form of political signaling, where the words themselves convey intent, priorities, and boundaries, without requiring immediate implementation, which helps leaders manage both domestic and international audiences simultaneously.
That's an excellent point, Julia. Political signaling theory explains this clearly, because in international relations, communication is not merely informative, but strategic, where leaders intentionally craft messages to influence perception, shape behavior, and create leverage, and in this case, the president's emphasis on domestic strength, economic sovereignty, and defense readiness can be seen as signaling both resolve and expectations, giving allies and competitors clues about the limits of cooperation and the stakes of negotiation.
Absolutely, Adam. Strategic ambiguity also plays a role, because deliberately leaving room for interpretation allows the United States to maintain flexibility in subsequent actions, whether in trade agreements, defense commitments, or diplomatic initiatives. And the ambiguity ensures that partners must engage in dialogue to clarify intentions, giving Washington a tactical advantage while maintaining the appearance of firmness, which is a common feature of high-level diplomacy in a multipolar world.
I agree, Julia. And it's interesting how these two interpretations, crisis versus strategy, can coexist simultaneously, because allies and rivals often perceive uncertainty and opportunity at the same time, depending on their domestic priorities, risk tolerance, and relationship with the United States, which is why international political analysis requires understanding both the explicit content of speeches and the implicit messages designed to guide perception, negotiation, and response.
Exactly, Adam. And for educational purposes, this illustrates a fundamental concept in international relations, that political communication is an instrument of power, not merely information, and that understanding rhetoric requires applying theory, context, and historical precedent, because leaders must navigate domestic pressures, alliance obligations, and global competition while signaling intent in ways that influence behavior without necessarily binding themselves immediately.
Another critical aspect is timing, Julia, because the speech was delivered during a period of heightened global attention on trade negotiations, defense planning, and energy security, which means that both the crisis and strategy interpretations gain credibility depending on how countries perceive urgency and stakes, and the dual reading highlights how powerful speeches can be in shaping expectations, even before policy measures are enacted.
Yes, and this dual reading also reflects the educational takeaway for listeners, because it demonstrates that a single presidential speech is never purely symbolic or purely directive. It operates simultaneously as a statement of intent, a negotiation tool, and a psychological instrument that influences decision-making across multiple levels of governance, markets, and public opinion, providing insight into how political strategy and communication theory converge in practice.
In conclusion, the speech can be understood both as a potential indicator of rising uncertainty and as a deliberate strategy to enhance negotiation leverage, reinforce domestic authority, and guide international perception. And both interpretations are valid, depending on perspective, which underscores the complexity of leadership communication in international relations.
Absolutely, Adam. And for listeners studying global politics, the lesson is that analyzing rhetoric requires careful attention to context, history, and strategic purpose, because words are not merely informative. They are instruments that shape negotiation, influence perception, and ultimately affect the behavior of nations in an interconnected world.
In our next section, we will explore the role of global media in framing the speech, showing how interpretation, amplification, and narrative construction shape both domestic and international perceptions and further influence policy, markets, and public discourse around the world.
Exactly, Adam, because understanding media framing helps listeners connect the dots between communication, perception, and decision-making, illustrating that the impact of a presidential speech extends far beyond the podium into the broader landscape of international politics, economics, and public opinion.
As we continue, Julia, it's impossible to ignore the role of media in shaping how President Donald Trump's speech was interpreted worldwide, because the same speech can be portrayed in vastly different ways depending on the outlet, region, and editorial perspective. And right after the address, headlines diverged sharply. In some European newspapers, the focus was on potential diplomatic strain and alliance tension, often using dramatic language to highlight uncertainty, while in American business publications, the emphasis was on trade positioning and strategic negotiation, framing the speech as calculated and purposeful, which shows how media framing can construct entirely different narratives from the same event.
Exactly, Adam. And social media amplifies this effect even further, because platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and global forums enable instant dissemination of clips, quotes, and commentary, allowing users to interpret, endorse, or challenge the message in real time, which creates a feedback loop where public perception can shift rapidly, sometimes reinforcing polarizing interpretations and sometimes pressuring governments and organizations to respond or clarify policy positions, making media both a platform for discussion and a tool that influences international diplomacy indirectly.
I agree, Julia, and another dimension is narrative competition, because multiple actors, including state media, independent outlets, analysts, and opinion leaders, are actively competing to shape the story in ways that advance their agendas, perspectives, or national interests. And this competition means that audiences receive conflicting messages, which can increase uncertainty for international observers, investors, and policymakers, and sometimes forces officials to address misinterpretations before they evolve into policy concerns or diplomatic misunderstandings.
Yes, Adam, and it's particularly interesting how public perception itself becomes a force that shapes foreign policy, because in today's interconnected environment, leaders monitor not just official responses, but also media coverage and social sentiment, and the way global audiences react can create pressure for adjustments in messaging, diplomatic engagement, or even economic decisions, which highlights that in the modern information environment, perception often carries as much weight as action, influencing strategy indirectly but powerfully.
Exactly, Julia. Speed is another critical factor because information cycles operate at lightning pace, with headlines, social media commentary, and analyst interpretations appearing within minutes of the speech, and this rapid dissemination means that both allies and rivals react almost instantly, adjusting markets, diplomatic messaging, and public statements, and leaders must consider not only what they say, but how it will be amplified, reframed, and interpreted by a global audience, making media literacy a key component of both political strategy and public understanding.
And that is why critical thinking about global news consumption is so important for listeners, Adam, because headlines alone rarely provide the full context, and understanding how framing, editorial choices, and platform algorithms influence perception helps citizens analyze events more accurately, rather than reacting solely to sensationalized or incomplete narratives, which is an essential skill in an age where media and politics are deeply intertwined.
Furthermore, the speech illustrates how information can be a form of modern political leverage because selective emphasis, repetition, and framing can magnify certain interpretations, guide audience attention, and create political momentum without immediate policy change, which is why analysts emphasize that the information environment itself is a battlefield where perceptions are contested, narratives are constructed, and influence is exerted globally.
Exactly, Adam. And for educational purposes, listeners should note that the speed, reach, and framing of media coverage can amplify both domestic and international reactions, meaning that a speech is only one piece of a larger communication ecosystem, and understanding how stories are presented helps students of politics, international relations, and economics see how perceptions can translate into tangible effects on markets, negotiations, and diplomatic behavior.
In summary, the global media response to the president's speech demonstrates that interpretation is as important as content, because different outlets, social platforms, and analysts craft narratives that shape public perception, influence policy discussions, and even affect economic decisions. And Julia, we can agree that this emphasizes the necessity of analyzing news critically rather than taking headlines at face value.
Absolutely, Adam. And as we conclude this section, it is clear that media framing and information dynamics are not just peripheral. They are central to understanding how political speeches influence both domestic and international audiences, creating consequences that ripple through diplomacy, economics, and public opinion, which is why global citizens and English learners alike benefit from developing the skills to interpret media thoughtfully and contextually.
Next, in our final section, we will bring together all these perspectives, domestic, European, Asian, Middle Eastern, and media framing, into an educational summary and calm closing, highlighting the lessons for international relations, economics, and strategic communication, while leaving listeners with a hopeful and insightful perspective on the future of global diplomacy.
Exactly, Adam. That final section will help our listeners consolidate their understanding of how one speech can ripple through politics, markets, and media, providing a complete picture of contemporary global interdependence and the role of strategic leadership in shaping the world stage.
As we draw this episode to a close, let's take a moment to step back and reflect on what we have explored together, because the recent speech by President Donald Trump illustrates just how deeply a single statement from a world leader can influence markets, shape diplomatic conversations, and trigger global strategic analysis. And throughout our discussion, we have seen that tone, framing, and timing matter as much as the words themselves, because in the interconnected world of today, allies and rivals alike interpret signals differently, responding not only to the substance of policy, but to the perceived intent, urgency, and confidence conveyed in the rhetoric.
Absolutely, Adam. For listeners, it's crucial to understand that strategy and crisis can appear remarkably similar in the early stages, because a strong, assertive message can be perceived either as a sign of careful negotiation or as a harbinger of instability, depending on who is interpreting it, and that is exactly why careful analysis matters. Looking at global reactions from Europe, China, the Middle East, and the Global South teaches us that each region applies its own lens based on history, interests, and risk perception, which reminds us that international politics is never one-dimensional, and simple explanations are rarely accurate.
Exactly, Julia. We also saw how markets, energy sectors, and multinational corporations respond not just to enacted policies, but to perceived signals, demonstrating that in modern geopolitics, information itself functions as a tool of strategy, because statements about trade, defense, or sovereignty reverberate across financial markets and supply chains within hours, creating immediate consequences and shaping longer-term planning, which reinforces the point that words have power, and understanding their potential impact is essential for informed global citizenship.
I completely agree, Adam. And from an educational perspective, listeners should consider 3 key lessons. First, follow world news in English, because accessing information directly from multiple sources helps you understand nuance. Second, analyze speeches critically, asking what is stated explicitly, what is implied, and how different audiences might interpret the message. And third, recognize multiple perspectives, because global reactions often differ based on historical experience, economic dependency, or strategic priorities. And understanding these variations is essential for balanced analysis rather than reactive emotion.
Yes, Julia. Adding to that, it's clear that global politics today is highly interconnected, because a single speech can move currencies, affect stock markets, influence oil prices, and reshape diplomatic calculations simultaneously. And as we've seen from European, Chinese, Middle Eastern, and Global South responses, even measured or subtle statements carry the potential to alter alliances, trade negotiations, and security postures, highlighting how interdependent the world has become and how critical it is to observe not only domestic implications, but also international ripple effects.
Absolutely, Adam. So, dear listeners, staying informed is not just about following headlines, it's about understanding the complexity behind them, analyzing the strategies at play, and thinking critically about how policy signals, political rhetoric, and media framing interact, because this approach equips you to interpret events thoughtfully, recognize patterns in international behavior, and engage with global issues as an informed observer rather than a passive consumer of dramatic narratives.
In closing, let us reflect calmly on what this episode teaches us. One speech can move currencies, influence alliances, shape narratives, and prompt strategic recalculation within hours, which underscores the importance of understanding global political communication not as a peripheral skill, but as an essential capability for anyone who wants to engage with the modern world thoughtfully and effectively.
Exactly, Adam. And while the complexities of global politics can feel overwhelming, remaining analytical, informed, and open to multiple perspectives provides hope that diplomacy, negotiation, and cooperation can continue to guide the world through uncertainty. Because in today's interconnected reality, knowledge and understanding are the tools that allow citizens, leaders, and institutions to respond wisely and constructively to global challenges.
So, dear listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey through strategy, crisis, and global perception. And remember that every informed analysis adds to your ability to navigate the complexities of international affairs with insight, calm, and confidence.
Yes, and we invite you to share your thoughts, perspectives, and questions in the comments below, telling us where you are listening from and what insights you gained from today's discussion. Because dialogue and curiosity are at the heart of understanding the world's most important events.
Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and continue exploring global issues with a calm and analytical mindset, because understanding the nuances of leadership, communication, and strategy is what shapes the global citizens of tomorrow.
Thank you again for listening to the English Globe. We look forward to continuing this journey with you in our next episode, exploring more stories that shape the world and deepen your understanding of international affairs.